Welcome to Leauge of Lit, where we discuss books, adaptations, and anything else we wish to talk about and tie it to lit. Because we can.
Yes. But as we need to make sure that we cover our bases, because it is a truth universally acknowledged that we are not a spoiler-free podcast. Just like if you're a single man in possession of a good fortune, you must be in want of a wife.
Must be.
It is a universal truth. Alrighty, so if you haven't guessed already, we are talking about Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice.
Pride and Prejudice.
Which was published on January 28th, 1813. And so the initial title that Jane Austen, like the working title for it, was First Impressions, and then it developed and changed, as most things do. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to note that there's a variety of genres that this book is like labeled under, but the one that most people seem to forget is satire.
It's full satire.
Like, a lot of people put, oh, this is just, it's a great romance story. It's a love story. Yes, but
it's also just full satire on what Jane Austen's life was around her.
And I think as far as being able to like truly grasp that as a modern audience, if you've never seen Becoming Jane, like I think that is the best like display of how satirical and critical Jane Austen was of her world, because you would never actually be able to grasp that through the letters that she wrote to her sister unless you actually know that.
Yeah. I think that movie is it's probably the best representation we've ever gotten of Jane Austen's life.
I think so too.
There's only a couple other ones.
Yeah.
It's set in 1812, which I mean, think about what was going on in the world in 1812.
Yep.
In Hertfordshire and Derbyshire.
So it, instead of it being, like all of England, or, as we'll discuss for some other Austen novels, because we have some more of those coming down the pike for this podcast. We're not going to Bath or anywhere else. We're staying relatively close. Mm-hmm. But there's really only like two defined locations. So we'll dive into just talking about the novel first real quick. As we so cleverly decided to do our spoiler warning with the truth universally acknowledged, that is one of the most famous opening lines in all of literature.
Yep. I feel like everybody knows that line, even if they're not 100% sure where it comes from.
That like explains even more of like how universally acknowledged that opening line is.
Yes. It is a truth universally acknowledged that opening line. Very, very, very famous.
Yeah, there's 61 chapters in this book, and the thing is, it's like hearing that alone can sometimes make a book sound daunting, but they're not very long chapters.
No, I mean, in all honesty, like the book's not that long. Mm-mm. And everything, I mean, at least to me, I have read it quite a few times, but everything in it goes by very quickly.
Yes. I mean, like, you get a description of the Bennets. You have 5 daughters: Lizzie, Jane, or I guess I should do this like in actual like birth order.
In actual order?
Yeah. Because it's a weird thing because of how, so the book is technically told from Lizzie's perspective, mm-hmm. which is why most people, when they're thinking about it, put Lizzie first. But Lizzie is actually the second born. So you mm-hmm. have Jane, Lizzie, Mary, Kitty, and then Lydia, which I think is also another thing of like, sometimes it's easy to switch Kitty and Lydia because
Lydia goes off and like actually does things.
Yes.
Like Lydia causes
trouble.
And yeah, Lydia gets into trouble. I mean, she gets married first.
She does.
So I think people are like, well, Kitty's obviously youngest. And it's like, no, Lydia's barely 15.
And Kitty's only, it does state in the novel that Kitty is 2 years older than mm-hmm. Lydia.
Yes.
But I don't know that we ever get a clear idea of how old the other Bennet sisters are.
I know Lizzie says that she's not 1 in 20.
I've never had like a clear idea.
No,
of how old she
is. Genuinely, like, other than for sure we get Lydia's age at some point, mm-hmm. and we get Lizzie's age sort of at some point. So then I just kind of like, well, and we get Kitty's because we know how old Lydia is.
Right. Because it stated that Kitty is 2 years older.
Yeah, so Lydia's 15, Kitty would be 17. My guess is that Mary would either be 18 or 19.
Yeah.
Lizzie would be 20, and then Jane would be 22, 21, 24. We don't know. There's literally no information.
There's no idea of like really getting an idea of like, okay, where are they actually?
Yeah, it's just kind of
but different adaptations allude to different things.
Yes, they do.
But I think also the ambiguity of the other Bennett sister, like of Jane, Lizzie, and Mary's ages, it opens up when you're casting for different things of how it is you choose to cast it. After we get our, opening line, we're told that Netherfield
Park has been let at last.
Exactly. And Mr. Bennett is doing what he loves most, which is teasing his wife.
Yes.
We don't really ever get like a clear idea as to why he likes to do this. But he likes to do it, and he gets a good kick out of it.
Because her nerves have been his constant companion these past 25 years. I guess that's probably why.
Something like that.
They're such an entertaining couple in that you never fully understand what they saw in each other. Mm-hmm. Because obviously, that doesn't seem to be a marriage that was of convenience. It doesn't seem to be a marriage that was of money. So, they had to have liked each other a little bit.
Yeah.
And you get little moments, especially like the 2005 one. There's like a little moment where you get like that they like each other, that they actually do care for each other.
Yeah.
But there's a lot less of that in the book.
Yes.
So you're kind of
you're like, reading between the lines a little bit.
How did they get to this point? If he loves making her life, if he loves to tease her so much, and she is excellent at making his life ridiculous, is the best word I can come up with.
Yes.
Although I don't think she realizes quite how ridiculous she makes everything.
No, not at all. I think she's very self-unaware.
She's very self-unaware. I think she's very unaware, period, because she's unaware of other people as well.
Yeah. And
it's always fascinating to me to wonder. I've always thought it would be so cool for somebody to give us like a Mr. and Mrs. Bennett meeting story. I wish Jane Austen was still around so I could ask her.
There's that. You'd think with all of the published fan fiction that has been like made into books and whatnot, we would have something.
I wonder if there is, and I've just never looked hard enough. I'm gonna look.
Maybe. But it is stated in the first chapter that Mr. Bennett considers all of his daughters to be very silly,
except for Lizzie.
But he does have a favor for Lizzie.
Yes,
because she has intelligence. Like you have like kind of like a word description for almost each of the Bennets. But like for Jane, she's all about like, she's pretty much her only like source of quote value is her beauty. There's so much more to the character of Jane Bennett, but
they put a lot of that as like the most important thing, because she'll never find a good husband if she's not absolutely beautiful.
Exactly.
Because she's so beautiful, it is obvious that the richest man who comes to town, well, not the richest, the second richest man who comes to town would want her.
Yes.
He has to. He'd be stupid not to.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Lizzie's described with her quickness is the word that they actually use, but it's referring to her wit and
her sharp tongue.
Her quickness of tongue, her sarcasm.
Yes.
And then Lydia's described as having good humor.
Yeah. But I think it's just a nice way of saying that she's silly.
Yeah.
That she's a ridiculous girl. That she probably honestly reminds him the most of his wife.
I would say so. But we get the clear idea that Mrs. Bennett's life goal is to marry off her daughters.
Which, when you have $5...
Especially with the like times as they were then where women could not inherit anything unless they were, like massively rich. There was nothing that they could do. So the only way for a woman to truly be taken care of is to marry.
Yeah.
Which is such an unfortunate like situation, but it is what it is.
So we get obviously the introduction of Bingley's coming to town, and the only way to get introduced to anyone in that kind of society back then was for typically your father or the male figure in your house to go and meet them, and then they may introduce you. Back then you weren't allowed to just walk up to strangers and become friends.
This is true.
So Mrs. Bennet is insistent that Mr. Bennet go and meet Mr. Bingley so that the girls can meet Mr. Bingley. And Mr. Bennet flatly refuses.
This is true.
I don't know why I should need to go, is essentially what he says.
Yes.
Even though he knows full well.
But I think to an extent, it almost gives Mr. Bennet a sense of modernism.
Yeah.
Because it is absolutely ridiculous that is the only way that you can meet anybody.
Yeah, because he's got to be exhausted of being the person that has to go to things because he doesn't want to go to parties and he doesn't want to go to dinners. He wants to stay home and sit in his library. So for him to have to continuously go out and meet people just so his daughters can maybe marry well, it must be exhausting for him.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I can't imagine, I don't even like doing that for myself.
No, I'm I don't want to go out and meet people, so I can't imagine having to go out and meet people so that everybody else can go out and meet people.
Exactly. I couldn't imagine being that foot forward.
Oh, it'd be ridiculous. I wrote this down. I have no idea why. We learn in chapter 2 that Lydia is in fact the tallest sister.
I think I missed that.
Why did I write that down?
I don't know.
I don't know why I felt I was like, this feels like I should.
That is interesting considering most
adaptations do not do that.
Most adaptations portray her as shorter because she's the youngest.
She's the youngest. I think I thought
she's
it was
also
interesting.
more than likely not done growing yet.
Oh my god.
In chapter 2 is when we get a better picture of Mary Bennet, which is that she has deep reflection and she reads a lot.
It means she is not very fun.
Nope. And it's interesting seeing how each adaptation chooses to portray her or not in some cases.
Yeah, some cases you don't get a Mary.
I don't think this is a super famous quote, but it's definitely one that I see float around a bunch from in the Jane Austen and literary realm of to be fond of dancing was a certain step towards falling in love.
I literally wrote dancing equals love. Fondness of dancing equals love. I mean, I guess if that's what you did, that's what you did back then, though. They went to balls and they had parties, and that was the only intimacy they had before you got married, was dancing and the brush of a hand and all of that beautiful, just little adorable romantic things.
Yes.
So, I mean, yeah, I guess, because you weren't allowed to be alone with a man that you weren't married to. So you had to, that was the only time you had conversation that was just the two of you, and it was the only time you could actually touch each other and be near each other. Yeah. So I can see how that would be what would lead to marriages and love back then.
Oh, absolutely. And I will say the way that most adaptations portray those moments, if that's what our dances would actually look like these days, I probably would have been more open to going and participating.
I would have been so happy to go, but no, we do the Superman and what were we doing in high school?
We had the Cupid Shuffle.
And the wobble.
Yep. The cha-cha slide.
Yeah. Which they're not fun. And slow dances were all awkward and, it's just your arms around his shoulders and his are just barely on your waist because you're pimply babies and
yeah.
That's
nobody actually knows how to dance.
No, we don't, because we're not taught. Back then you were taught how to dance. As a woman, you had to know how to dance.
And there were different dances for different pieces of music.
Yeah.
And they were very intricate and group and oriented and
and society, different levels of society had different dances because in Hertfordshire where we are, it's gonna be more of a country dance, whereas if you went into London it would be more of a societal dance. So that was a big part of how they expressed themselves back then. So Bennett, just Bennett, his name's just Bennett. So Mr. Bennett goes to meet Mr. Bingley and tells nobody because he is sneaky until he finally feels like he should say something because Mrs. Bennett won't leave him alone and has decided that she doesn't care to meet Bingley now. To which Mr. Bennett responds with, well, if you told me that before, I wouldn't have gone to see him. And then the house is in an uproar.
Yes. And then we have our first, or we hear rumors of who Bingley is bringing with him, and initially it's meant to be like a very large party where there's supposed to be 12 ladies and 7 gentlemen.
Mm-hmm.
Like, then it ended up being like 6 people, 5 sisters and 1 cousin.
Yes.
But then the final count ends up being 2 sisters and 2 gentlemen.
Yes.
Well, and one of said gentlemen is Mr. Darcy.
Mr. Darcy.
So Bingley and Darcy are 2, like, I guess you could say, like, main men that we're actually, like, men. Concerned about.
Yeah, they're the men we're supposed to care about.
Yes. And, like, the impressions that we get aren't necessarily, like, obviously Bingley comes across as very, very agreeable. Yeah. Mr. Darcy, not so much.
Yeah, because they say Bingley is good-looking and gentlemanlike. His sisters are fine women. Mm-hmm. Mr. Hurst, which is his sister's husband, mm-hmm. merely looked the gentleman. I wrote that down because I loved it so much. He just looked like a gentleman, but he actually wasn't.
No, and the way that they portray him in the 95 is hilarious.
So funny.
So hilarious.
And then Mr. Darcy has a fine figure, is rich, has poor manners, and is above being pleased. It's so entertaining to me.
Oh, it's downright hilarious.
He's also the proudest, most disagreeable man. It's a direct quote. Mm-hmm. So this is when we have what is the first dance of the book. There's many in the book. Many. But this is because that was, all you could do back then. This is the first like party dance that we go to. Mm-hmm. And you get sort of this really quick look at all of these different characters that we've just been introduced to in 2 chapters.
Yep. And we're getting an idea of how it is that they act in society.
Yes.
Because obviously, as is true for anybody, you act differently in public than you do in private.
Yes, absolutely. And obviously, some people give off really great impressions. Bingley, his sisters give off good impressions. Mr. Hurst, obviously.
Relatively good impressions.
Relatively okay impression. And nobody in town likes Mr. Darcy.
This is true. And I made this specific note that Darcy slights Elizabeth and makes eye contact with her.
I love it, though.
But the thing is I don't know that there's an adaptation that actually, like, portrays the fact that they make eye contact when he says that she's not tolerable.
The 1995 one is the closest. Probably. Where he notices that she's there after he has said it.
Yeah.
And it's obvious that she listened because she gets up and goes over to Charlotte. But yeah, there's nobody really portrays that moment of where he's just like, she's tolerable but not handsome enough to tempt me, and he's just staring right at her.
Yeah.
I would be so mad. I'd be like, oh, okay. All right. Bring it on. And then we get Bingley saying that Jane is the most beautiful creature he has ever beheld. Mm-hmm. And what a precious couple they are.
Truly, truly precious. We've mentioned her, but let's go ahead and dive a little bit into Charlotte, who is Lizzie's best friend. And it is established that Charlotte is 27.
Yes, they do tell you that.
Which is where we get in the 2005 version, that when she's making a list of why it is, when she justifies who she's engaged to later.
Yeah, I'm 27 years old.
I have no money and
my
no
parents.
prospects.
I love that both of us can just immediately quote that.
Well, lately I've seen it a bunch in like meme form because a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, I'm 27. This is my life. And it's like, oh Lord.
Yeah. I'm already a burden to my parents. I have no money, no connections.
This is fine.
Which was a big thing, her being 27 and not being married.
It was.
Back
for
then?
That society, because you have, the life expectancy is not what it is today. You have generally just like the massive amount of pressure to be married. Which, Which, I mean, like, if you think about it, for Austen, like, she
refused.
She never married.
She never got married. She was engaged once.
Once.
For one night.
But, like, she was more concerned about her writing than she was about being married, because she didn't want it to, like, she didn't want to be married because society said, hey, you need to be married.
Well, she was already in love with
This is true.
with writing.
This is true.
I think that was the great love of Jane Austen's life, was writing her own novels.
Absolutely.
So I think she didn't feel the need to find that in another human being. So after the dance,
we get Mrs. Bennet recapping the dance.
The entire thing to Mr.
The
Bennet.
entire thing to the whole family, actually.
Well, yeah.
And it's like, it hasn't even been like a whole day gone by. Like, this is literally hours after it's done.
Yes.
Like, they were not there to see it all happen.
Yeah. Like, okay. We were in the room. Did she not see us? Like, we all got introduced to Mr. Bingley. Jane's like, yeah, I danced with him. I was there. I saw it happen. I was the one dancing. Like,
yeah.
Mrs. Bennet just, I think, feels the need to fill silence.
I think silence bothers her very much.
Silence would fully bother her.
Oh, absolutely. And we also get, during this section, because they do talk about Darcy slighting Lizzie. And, I mean, Lizzie states that I could easily forgive his pride had he not wounded mine. And that leads into where Mary gives us a definition and a distinction between pride and vanity.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very important part of the book, because, I mean, for heaven's sakes, the title is Pride and Prejudice.
Yeah.
That is a huge important thing that exists throughout the entire novel.
Yeah. It's the main themes fall around Pride and Prejudice.
Yes.
We also learn how quickly Bingley took to Netherfield. Took him 30 minutes to decide he wanted to live there.
Yeah.
It's very impressive.
Oh, absolutely.
For a house that size, for somebody who'd never bought really anything, because he, you know, any property that he owned, well, he didn't buy Netherfield, he rented it, but
yeah,
anybody who had to buy property or rent property back then, that was probably a big thing for them. And he was just like, this is nice. And it just kind of shows Bingley's character of being very agreeable and very easygoing, that he was like, I like it.
Yeah.
Without knowing anything.
In chapter 6, that's when we find out that Darcy actually has interest in Lizzie.
It's so... the 180 that man goes through because he just doesn't know how to behave around people.
I think there's a level of he has a hard time figuring out how to express himself.
Yeah, no, he's it's been said a lot that he just doesn't understand how to express his feelings. Words are not his strong suit.
Right.
So
but the way that we find out that he has interest is we have this quote of he has a pair of fine eyes. Yes. That is the defining trait for Elizabeth Bennet. She has fine eyes.
She has fine eyes and her light, appealing figure. I mean, you know, physical things are typically the first thing you notice about somebody. So
this is true, but it's the fine eyes is the big thing, because you'll see later on in the book where Caroline repeatedly teases him for it.
Yes.
And it's slightly unclear as to whether or not it's because she is jealous or she's just trying to make him feel bad about that.
Who knows?
Understanding Caroline Bingley's motivations are weird, and I don't know how to do it.
Every adaptation, they seem different.
This is true.
Because I do think in the book it's not fully clear what her motivations are.
No, not at all.
Is she in love with Darcy? Does she just want to make fun of Darcy because it's fun for her? Does she just not like Lizzie? There's so many ways that you could go with that.
In chapter 7 is when we find that the militia have arrived in Meryton.
Yes. And Kitty and Lydia are the silliest girls in the county.
This is true.
It's still true to this day.
Absolutely true. But Jane also gets her letter from Caroline to come and dine with her and Louisa, who's the other Bingley sister, but it's Hurst, not Bingley, because she's married.
Louisa Hurst.
But she gets invited to come and dine with them, which was a huge deal.
A huge deal.
But it's noted in the note that the gentlemen will be dining out.
Dining out?
This is where we get a glimpse into how calculating Mrs. Bennet can actually be, because she refuses to allow Jane to take the carriage that the family does in fact have and makes her ride on horseback because it looks like it's going to rain.
It looks like it might rain.
And so because of the rain, Jane will be soaked to the bone, which will then turn into an illness, because that is how illnesses worked back then, apparently.
Apparently, you got wet and you were sick.
Like, I don't know of a time that I've ever been soaked to the bone because of rain and I got sick, but you know.
I can't either. I used to play in the rain as a kid.
Exactly. But apparently that's how illnesses worked back then.
Whatever works.
And because of that, and because of knowing how good-natured Bingley is and just the limited amount of interaction we've already had with him, Mrs. Bennet knows that he will insist that Jane cannot leave until she is better.
Yes, so Jane will have to stay and she and Bingley will fall in love and get married. That's the plan.
And the thing is she literally lays out that plan in front, and both Jane and Lizzie are like, what?
Mom?
No.
Please? No. And yet it still happens.
It does.
That way, well, minus them getting married, but like...
Yes,
she does end up having to stay there. Mm-hmm. And because of that, Lizzie, who loves her oldest sister probably best, for sure
I think they have a different kind of bond than the rest of the Bennet sisters.
Lizzie decides that she's going to walk all the way to Netherfield by herself, which goes over really well, if you could guess, with Caroline and Louisa. But
if you think about it, even Mrs. Bennet, like, insisted that that Lizzie don't do that because her dress was 6 inches deep in mud.
Yeah, her appearance would be unfit
to see anybody.
Society. Yes.
And Lizzie's response is, but I will be okay to see Jane, and that's all I care about.
Yep, pretty much. She's like, but I want to see my sister, and that's the most important thing. Mm-hmm. And so Lizzie does, in fact, walk I think it's like 3 miles.
Something
I don't
like
actually know. To Netherfield.
It's several miles. It's no
miles.
small walk at all. But
and then also gets invited to stay so that she can stay with her sister. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately for Lizzie, that means that she is going to have to mingle in the society, whereas Jane gets to stay in bed because she is ill.
Yes, we have a month-long stay at Netherfield that we get to walk through. Is that?
I think it's...
Am I right in understanding it that way?
Almost a month.
Yeah, it's somewhere around...
It's a long time.
It is. It's a lot longer than what most people would do.
Like, if I'm sick with a cold, I might need to, stay the night.
Right.
If I'm not feeling well, I'll just stay the night. But, I'm not going to need to stay at your house for a month. But this is a different time and a different world.
It is.
So, yeah, they essentially, I think, have to stay about a month.
And this is where we get a little bit more of a perspective of the Bingley sisters. We kind of see a little bit of Darcy's transformation and how he acts towards Lizzie. That doesn't necessarily mean that Lizzie sees the transformation, because Lizzie sees what Lizzie sees.
Yes.
This is also during this time is when we get the definition of what an accomplished woman is.
What an accomplished woman is based on what... I don't actually think that this is necessarily what Darcy would say is an accomplished woman. I think it's what Caroline thinks Darcy would think is an accomplished woman, and he just agrees because he's Darcy. And I don't think he's going to argue with it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I think different adaptations
take it different ways. But it is ultimately defined by Darcy as to what an accomplished woman is. Yes.
And I think to an extent it's what he's pushing Georgiana, his sister, to be. Yeah.
It's just funny because
we hear a little bit of murmurings about Georgiana during this Netherfield stay.
It's just funny because if you read this definition and then you think about it, you're like, I don't considering who you end up with, this definition don't fully work. I wrote down the exact quote.
By all means, read it.
A woman must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, dancing, drawing, and the modern languages, must possess a certain something in her air, manner of walking, the tone of her voice, her address and expressions, and improvement of her mind by extensive reading.
Like, who has the time to do all of that?
Nobody.
And let's be honest, just because you try certain things does not mean you are gifted with said things. Not everybody is gifted with a voice to sing or rhythm to be able to dance well.
I mean, we do see that later. I guess they should have a knowledge of singing, but my God, I think it's written in my notes for the 1995 adaptation that, my God, having to sit through somebody who couldn't actively play piano that well and couldn't really sing must have been awful, but it was the expectation that women know how to do it, so you had to put up with it. So,
this is very true.
So, really the next thing that happens is we do get a visit from Mrs. Bennet before the girls leave.
This is true. And I have it written down that Lizzie actually sent for Mrs. Bennet because she thought that that would be something that would help Jane in her process of getting better.
Yes. And what a visit that was.
Full of ridiculousness.
Always.
Is there ever a time when Mrs. Bennet is in the room and it's not ridiculousness?
Well, you know, she's like, Jane is still too ill to be moved, as if, like, she doesn't just have a cold.
Yeah. She claims that all of her daughters are better looking than anybody else. I'm sorry. What?
I mean, she got some gumption, Mrs. Bennet. She also essentially, like, sort of comes for Darcy. She's very mean to Darcy.
She is absolutely vicious.
She's so vicious. Right, and it's right after she sort of berates Lizzie for poking fun at Mr. Bingley in the nicest way possible, because Lizzie, of course, is not going to poke fun at Bingley in the meanest way.
Right.
And they're at that point friends, you know, in the general sense of the word.
Right.
So,
but it's also interesting because I'm pretty confident that the reason why Mrs. Bennet is so vicious towards Darcy is because he slighted Lizzie. Which is funny because you don't really get the sense that Mrs. Bennet actually cares about Lizzie.
You really don't. She would seemingly be the least favorite daughter, which is not a nice thing to say, but you know what I mean.
But it's because of Lizzie's like lack of interest in marrying for the sake of marrying. And
her sharp tongue has probably bitten Mrs. Bennet a couple of times in her life. So, and then Mrs. Bennet goes on to tell Bingley about the suitor that Jane had when she was 15, as if that's going to help any sort of.
Right.
And we get one of my favorite moments in this is when they talk about poetry being, you know, the food of love. And Lizzie says, I'm convinced that one good sonnet will starve it entirely.
Oh, yeah.
And it's just so interesting because Mr. Darcy hops on that so quick, as if like he was thinking about writing poetry for her.
He may have been because I mean, that was probably something that he truly considered. But because of what Lizzie states, he's like, wait, so how do you want this?
Yeah, he's almost asking her, how can I woo you?
Yeah.
If you don't want sonnets, what do you want?
Yeah.
So that is very fun. Fun moment.
Oh, yes.
And we also get Lydia mentioning the ball that Bingley had promised, which nobody else was privy to really at that point.
Right.
I always wonder, I'm like, was there actually a ball, or is just Bingley just too nice?
I want to say it's probably a little bit of he's too nice, because it would not surprise me at all, just with other things we get to see of Lydia throughout the story, that she could literally just say, yeah, you said this. And people would be like, what?
What?
When did I say that?
Yeah.
I will, like, if you say I said it, then maybe I did.
There's a lot of talk after Mrs. Bennet and all the other Bennet ladies leave. And starting in chapter 10, Caroline is it seems very heavily trying to get Mr. Darcy's attention.
Yes.
All the time. And Lizzie is very amused.
Absolutely.
Which, I mean, I would be too, my goodness, some of the stuff she does. But then we also
taking a turn about the room.
Yes, we're going to take a turn about the room. But, like, also, Caroline provokes Mr. Darcy a lot about Lizzie. And so it's that interesting, I'm like, is she negging Mr. Darcy? Like...
It's very not clear of what is it that Caroline's actually trying to achieve. Is she trying to get his attention because she's interested, or is she just trying to make him feel bad because he likes a not highborn woman?
Yeah, it's so, we've said it before, but her motives are very difficult to understand. We eventually get Jane being well enough to come down for dinner, which is nice. Nice little reprieve for Lizzie being the only one in the room. Mm-hmm. Which is when also, not too long after, we get our turn about the room with Caroline and Lizzie and that fantastic exchange where Mr. Darcy gives that whole speech.
Mm-hmm. My good opinion once lost is lost forever.
Oh my God, it's so good. And, you know, Mr. Darcy's not to be laughed at, but Lizzie dearly loves to laugh.
Yes.
Like, their flirtations are just so great.
Like, it's a whole different kind of flirtation, especially if you're, like, looking at the way that, like, Jane and Bingley flirt versus the way that Lizzie and Darcy flirt.
Yes.
It's two completely different, like, ways to do it. And it's utterly hilarious either way you watch it.
Yes. I mean, imagine flirting back then would have been almost a game.
Oh, absolutely.
I assume some of it is now, but I don't flirt that often, so like I don't have anything to go off of. But back then it must have been, because that was the only way you had your fun. Mm-hmm. You got to dance and flirt with men, and that was how you had a good time, because otherwise you were sewing handkerchiefs and learning to play the piano.
Yep. So after Lizzie and Jane leave Netherfield, this is when we get to meet Mr. Collins.
Oh my God, Mr. Collins.
Which, let's talk about Mr. Collins for a second. So what the novel tells us is that he is 25, he is tall and heavy looking.
And you never see that.
That is how he is described in the book. And we never
no
see
adaptation
that ever in any adaptation ever.
It's so like disconcerting. He's just never what you expect him to be. But it's so funny because every adaptation I'm like, yeah, that's Mr. Collins. I never question it.
And I think it's because
it's the attitude.
All actors who have ever portrayed Mr. Collins grasp the concept that he is painfully awkward. I wrote when we first get our intro of Mr. Collins in his letter, he writes, "I flatter myself." And I wrote that is one of Mr. Collins's favorite things to do is flatter himself and his patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Literally everything, any and every conversation that Mr. Collins ever has, he will inevitably bring up himself, something that he thinks is very positive about himself, which is actually honestly rather negative about himself, but he doesn't realize it for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And he will bring up Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Those are like the two guaranteed things he will bring up in any and every conversation.
Yes, himself and Catherine de Bourgh. And they say in chapter 15 that Mr. Collins was not a sensible man. And it's just proven fact.
Yep.
That he's just truly not.
Well, and you also get a sense, also in chapter 15, of how easily persuaded he can be.
Yeah.
That he really doesn't necessarily like have his own self of like, his own like mind of anything. Mm-hmm. It's literally, he is willing to be what anyone and everyone wants him to be. Except for, gone.
Yeah,
because he seems to be
away.
He seems to be like totally unaware of how his presence actually makes people uneasy. Yeah. And how much they want him to just not be there. Because of how awkward and really just like he makes so many wrong remarks that he thinks he's paying as compliments, but they're really not compliments.
No, they're truly not compliments.
Because he decided that he wanted to try and get Jane as his wife because Lady Catherine says it's important that I get a wife. And why not pick from the Bennet girls? Because I'm going to be inheriting their father's stuff.
It just makes sense.
It makes sense. Why not? And he is so easily persuaded because Mrs. Bennet tells him, oh, no. Jane's essentially spoken for now. So why not Lizzie?
Yeah, it's like, and I will always have the question in my brain of, did nobody think that Mary would be a good choice? Nobody?
They actually did. So like after this is, we don't get a look at that until after Lizzie has declined Mr. Collins' proposal of marriage,
it's just so
which is
sad.
very clumsily done. Well, I think a lot of people tend to forget Mary because she doesn't necessarily, like, her most defining trait is that she reads a lot.
And she almost wants to be forgettable.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that she doesn't like the big society things. And, I think a ball is a perfectly horrible way to meet new people.
Right.
Like, Mary doesn't want, she's not a normal girl.
No, she's not.
For that time period. Yeah. You're right.
Mm-hmm.
Just makes me sad for Mary.
It does. And I mean, we can talk about it a little bit more when we get to some of the adaptations, but like there is an adaptation that does give you a slight hint.
Yes.
That maybe Mary could have wanted it.
Yeah. I know what you're talking about. I literally see it in my head. So by the time we get to chapter 15, obviously we've just met Mr. Collins. We also get the introduction of another man.
Mr. Wickham.
Mr. Wickham, which everybody finds Mr. Wickham very charming, minus Darcy. They have a very cold meeting, which we don't get explanation of for a hot minute. But, we don't get real explanation of for a hot minute, I should say.
Yeah.
And the town is just in love with Mr. Wickham.
Oh, yes. He has managed a way to charm his way into everybody's hearts.
It's that Darcy says it. He is very easiness with friends. He is very easy nature with strangers. Because he's a charming man and he knows how to use words the right way and to smile at people the right way, whereas Darcy doesn't have that in him. And when Wickham finds out that Darcy's in town, he starts fishing.
Yep. Because he wants to know, like,
what Darcy has said.
Like, has anything been said? Which, I mean, we can already slightly surmise, but I don't know how much of this summation is. I've read the book so many times, so I know it, that Darcy is a rather private person. So for Wickham to assume that Darcy would have just been like, hi, my name is Fitzwilliam Darcy, and my sister Georgiana had this horrible thing happen to her just like a year or so ago, and this is the man that did it. Yeah, no, Darcy wasn't, and it was also not proper. No. That people know that about Georgiana and know what happened. So, because, it would have been scandalous for Georgiana to have that. And I think it's really interesting. He's giving this whole spiel and he's sort of exposing Darcy. And he says, till I can forget his father, I can never defy or expose him. While he's exposing the truth, in quotations, about what happened. It's his truth. Yeah, his version of the truth. Which is so, I'm like, wait, nobody thought you can't defy or expose him, but you're doing it right now. Yeah. That should be a red flag right there. It should be, but he has managed to charm his way into the hearts of many. But we also in chapter 15, we get introduced to some of the Bennet relations, which these are specifically like relations of Mrs. Bennet, the Phillipses, and they are local family that the Bennets get to regularly dine with and have, good family fun. And Mrs. Phillips, we see it a lot more later, but she's sort of, it's quite obvious that she and Mrs. Bennet are sisters. One and the same. Yeah. They're very similar, and Mrs. Phillips just sort of riles Mrs. Bennet up and the other way around. Yeah. We also find out in chapter 16 that
Darcy is the nephew of the great Lady Catherine de Bourgh.
Yes.
Which is a big deal to Mr. Collins.
Right, which is why he ends up making a fool of himself, insisting that he introduces himself to Mr. Darcy at a dinner at the Phillipses.
That's not how it works.
You can't just go up and introduce yourself to people.
And we find out Mr. Wickham's terrible truth about Mr. Darcy, about how after Darcy's father died, he took away the living that Darcy's father had promised to Wickham.
Yes.
And refused to give him the living, refused to give him money, refused to take care of him, and now he is a lowly soldier.
Mm-hmm. Which must be so difficult. It's not like you didn't have any choices at all in your life ever.
But we also know the truth, so like...
This is true. But even as I read it, I remember being like, did you not have choices?
You couldn't have done anything else?
That puts the military in a bad light because, you know, there are people out there that actively choose
to do that,
to be a part of it.
Yeah.
But Wickham has other ideas.
Wickham has many other ideas. He's very, he's like a weaselly little ferret.
Yes. Yes.
And Lizzie shares all of that with Jane.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Jane is the nicest person alive and just can't believe that that would be true.
Mm-hmm.
Because she knows Mr. Darcy.
Yeah.
I don't know. You slept for a month, Jane. We were all busy over here meeting Mr. Darcy, and you were asleep. So,
Yep. Mm-hmm.
I don't think you do. We get the personal invite to the Netherfield Ball, which is a huge deal, and
big deal.
In that, we also kind of sort of get Mr. Collins making his intentions to Lizzie known. And chapter 18 is the Netherfield Ball, which seems very early, but also doesn't seem early.
Right.
Seems like we've been doing a lot before the ball.
Mm-hmm. Well, and a lot of time has already passed in these 18 chapters.
I know. It's already been at least a month.
We have the fact that Wickham is actually not present at the ball, even though he is technically invited.
Technically.
Because, you know, a lot of militia are invited. So it's kind of like you're like lumped in with this. But he's not there. He has been, you know, sent away on some important business that could not wait. But is that truly what happened?
Is that really it?
Or is Mr. Wickham's comment of how, you know, if Darcy wishes to not be in the same room with me, then he has to go. It's like, really?
But you went.
But you were the one that was not there. Mr. Darcy was there.
Knowing what we know, I genuinely think that Wickham thought that if he showed up, Darcy would expose him in some way.
Probably.
I think Wickham realized that he couldn't be in the same room with Mr. Darcy. But we don't find that out till later. So at Netherfield Ball, Lizzie accepts a dance with Mr. Darcy.
Yes.
And is very upset at herself for it.
Because she couldn't figure out another way to get out of it.
She's like, I can't say no. I don't have anybody else on my card.
Mm-hmm.
She's just so mad that she has to be the one.
And also at this ball, we get what is essentially like defined as Lizzie's mortification. Because you get to see how truly ridiculous the Bennet family is, even on public display.
They are.
It's not just behind closed doors. It is even outside of those.
Yeah, the 1995 adaptation does a really good job of showing that off.
It's so uncomfortable to watch.
It makes me so uncomfortable. Oh, just embarrassing and loud and ridiculous they are.
Well, it's like you have Mrs. Bennet's comments about, you know, like Jane and Bingley and what's going on there. You have Mr. Collins being Mr. Collins, which is just, you know, generally awkward and very self-unaware. You have Mary's performance, because Mary decided that she was going to play the piano and sing at this ball.
And play the piano and sing things that were not exciting for other people.
Right. And then, you have Lydia and Kitty just, you know, downright exposing themselves.
To ridicule.
But after the Netherfield Ball is when we get Mr. Collins' proposal to Lizzie.
That's so funny.
And he flatters himself to no end for this. But Lizzie is trying very hard to be as nice as she possibly can be, but also firmly and very much tell him, not on your life.
Which, I mean, I commend her for being nice. She could have been rude.
And even as she was like trying to convey the no, never like sentiments, Mr. Collins is like, oh, but this is to be expected.
This is how ladies do things.
No woman in her right mind would ever accept the first proposal she receives.
That's ridiculous. Women must make themselves more eligible by pretending they don't want to be married to you. No. That's toxic behavior, sir.
No, really. We don't want it.
When we say no, we mean it. I know it's hard for people to understand. When we say no, we mean it. We also there's a little foreshadowing in Lizzie's whole thing about how she knows that Lady Catherine would find her an ill choice. Mm-hmm. She says that.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, foreshadowing. Thank you, Lizzie.
Which I think there's also something else that, like, in the way that, like, Collins, like, his choice of words, it makes you, or at least it made me, question what kind of a husband would he actually be? And that phrase is the violence of my affection.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Mr. Collins, are you saying that you will be a violent husband?
Is that what he means?
Like, are you just saying words because you think that they sound great? Because I think we have a little bit of an inconceivable moment here where you keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
So Lizzie denies Mr. Collins that she'll never marry him. She would never make him happy, and he certainly couldn't make her happy. Mm-hmm. And Mrs. Bennet calls her a headstrong, foolish girl.
Mm-hmm. Obstinate, headstrong girl.
And then proceeds to get Mr. Bennet as if he's going to force Lizzie to marry Mr. Collins, who says, your mother will never see you again if you do not marry Mr. Collins, and I will never see you again if you do. And that's support, ladies and gentlemen.
It also just shows even more about how Mr. Bennet enjoys teasing Mrs. Bennet.
Oh, yeah. No, that's just another moment where he enjoyed vexing her, as she would say.
I mean, ultimately, like, Mr. Bennet applauds Lizzie for her choice of saying no.
Which is another moment of Mr. Bennet being a very modern father. Mm-hmm. In that he's not going to say, well, you have to marry Mr. Collins because somebody's got to do it.
Yep. And I think to an extent that is a little bit of a glimpse, just, and I'm basing this off of like what we get to see in Becoming Jane, of the kind of father that Mr. Austen, like Jane's father, was.
Yeah.
Where he wasn't about to make her do something because she didn't want to do it.
Yeah, that has to be a figure that she wrote based on that.
Oh, absolutely.
There's no way. Because she's, we already know that a lot of her figures in her books are fully just based on people in her life. So after Mr. Collins proposes and gets rejected, we get a letter from Caroline Bingley.
And we find out that the Bingleys are leaving and that there's suspicion that maybe Bingley and Georgiana will be endgame.
And that's another moment of what did Caroline Bingley mean when she said she'll soon call Miss Darcy her sister?
Because it could go
either way.
But the suspicion that Jane takes out of it is that Bingley will be marrying Georgiana, not that Caroline will be marrying Mr. Darcy.
It could have gone either way. There's no way of knowing without Jane Austen here to tell me. Which is sad. Jane's very upset that they're going away, and at this point there are no plans to return. And then we get Charlotte accepting Mr. Collins' proposal, because when you get rejected once, just try another time.
Yeah. But I mean, so I always can't say I've like fully understood like how it happened, but as of like with the recent reread, it's like, no, literally like Charlotte swooped in and was like, well, let me take Mr. Collins off your hands, like trying to do a favor to Lizzie, because obviously the house was in an uproar because Lizzie said no. It's
like she's trying to do a favor for Lizzie and also trying to do a favor for her parents at the same time. Mm-hmm. She's trying to help more than one person and sort of sacrificing herself to the life of being Mrs. Collins.
Right. But I don't think when Charlotte like agreed to invite Mr. Collins to dinner with her family, I don't know that marriage was on her mind.
I don't think so either.
When she did that.
I think she was just like, well, everything at the Bennetts is going to be in an uproar. He's going to be awkward. So he can come to my house. We already know who he is. We'll deal with it for tonight and tomorrow, you know, whatever. And then I think Mr. Collins was like, she'll do.
Yeah. Yep.
So sad. But Charlotte even says, I am not romantic. So she would be fine marrying somebody for convenience.
After all of that fun stuff, we get to meet the Gardners, which is another relation of Mrs. Bennet's, but I think it's the brother?
I think it's her brother. I think Mr. Gardner is her brother.
Yeah. I want to say that that's what it is because Mrs. Gardner does not feel like she actually fits in.
At all.
With Mrs. Phillips and Mrs. Bennet.
And even Mr. Gardner. You can tell he's the boy in the family.
Yeah.
Where he's like, I was not privy to their silly games. I had to work. So we meet the Gardners and Jane accepts to go to London with them, which is where they live.
We also get the glimpse that Mrs. Gardner doesn't like Mr. Wickham.
It's such a interesting, nice little moment.
Then after we get that introduction, Lizzie travels with Charlotte's father and sister
Mariah.
to visit with Charlotte. So then we get to officially meet Lady Catherine de Bourgh as they get to dine at Rosings.
Which is Mr. Collins' favorite thing.
His favorite place in the world. And Lady Catherine, like, essentially grills Lizzie.
I know.
About her whole existence.
About everything, as if she's been very privy to some information. That maybe somebody thinks Lizzie has a pair of fine eyes. Maybe. Which I would just assume, like, it's Caroline writing Lady Catherine de Bourgh.
Maybe.
I don't know. Like,
it's like, I can't imagine that, like, Darcy would.
No, and I don't think he would ever have told his aunt that because he had to know that she wanted him to marry her daughter.
Yes.
Obviously.
Yes.
So,
and I can't necessarily imagine that Georgiana would portray her brother so because they have such a special relationship.
Yeah.
Like, I can't imagine that would be. So it would have to be.
It'd have to be like Caroline.
Or it could, like, some of the things that that she grills him on, that she grills Lizzie on could very well be because of Mr. Collins, because as we learn later, Mr. Collins has no sense of secrecy about anything.
So he quite obviously told Lady Catherine that Lizzie denied him and said that they could never make each other happy. And obviously Lady Catherine feels very strongly about Lizzie. You know, she says that she gives her opinion very decidedly for so young a person, as if that is the worst thing that's ever happened.
Clearly. But during this visit to Rosings, this is where we get to meet Cardinal Fitzwilliam, which not all
the adaptations do him justice.
Yes.
And I'm looking at you, 2005.
Well, I think it depends on the focus that you're trying to provide.
Yeah. I will say the book gives you this sort of idea of a flirtation between Lizzie and Fitzwilliam.
Yes.
Which is why in the 2005 version I was like, that's Fitzwilliam? That's Colonel Fitzwilliam? That's the choice you made? Okay. Well, I guess it's good that you didn't spend any time on him. But again, yeah, it's just how much time you really have to spend on him.
Because, I mean, like, you have it, like, there's definitely, like, without a doubt, there's definitely, like, a solid friendship.
Yes.
Between the two.
Yes.
But there's, you know, there is a sense of, like, well, maybe this could be a thing. Maybe.
The Lizzie Bennet Diaries does it in a way that I liked. And while all of this is going on, Jane's just been in London. And she has called on Caroline Bingley. And it has not gone well for her.
It has not gone in her favor, let's say that.
She has yet to see Charles Bingley, which is the reason, you know, she'd want to call on Caroline Bingley. And she's essentially sort of figured out that she and Caroline were never really friends. Which is sad for her. Poor Jane being disappointed by people over and over again because she's too nice.
And yet she still won't think ill of them.
I know. She's too nice.
She's too good-natured for that.
All the world is agreeable in her eyes.
But it is during this stay at Rosings that Darcy decides, let me just do it. And he proposes to Lizzie. And he does it rather awkwardly.
Rather horribly.
But, like, he says that he's like, I have to tell you how ardently I love you. Which is, I mean, like, definitely a great way to express it. But then all of the reasons that he gives, it's like, I'm sorry, is this meant to, like, make me want to marry you? Or are you just, like, slapping me with your insults here?
He just talks about how bad her family is and how her connections are terrible. And it would be awful if he was with her. But will you marry me? And she's like, hold up. Hold on.
You
what?
like me against your better judgment? What?
Yeah. She says, I have never desired your good opinion. Mm-hmm. Which, yeah, cool. Yep. And she accuses him of keeping Jane and Bingley apart, which he doesn't deny. He says, I have no wish to deny it.
Yep.
Because he knows what he did, and he brings up Wickham. She brings up Wickham, which is not a good
Probably
choice.
Probably not her finest hour, but it's what she does.
Moment.
It's what she does.
And, you know, this is your opinion of me, is what he says.
Mm-hmm. And she, like, ends her rejection with that, like, he is the last man in the world she could ever be prevailed upon to marry. Uh-huh. Which, it's so interesting to see the different adaptations take on that line. Because some of them include every aspect of it, and some of them, you know, rephrase it depending on, you know, like, what situation it's been put in.
Yeah.
The aftermath of the rejection, because here it is again. Lizzie has rejected yet another proposal, so we are 2 for 2 here.
We're 2 for 2, and one of them has 10,000 a year. Exactly. Her mother would be so upset.
And yet she's not, because she doesn't like him.
I know, right?
As they're both, like, processing through all of that, like, what had happened in their own ways, Darcy writes Lizzie a letter explaining himself.
Because he's not good with words.
He's not good at verbalizing words.
Yeah, he's not good with verbal words.
He's great with words on paper.
You know what I meant?
But I think it's important that, you know, like, you have that distinction.
Yes.
And he, I mean, like, we kind of skipped over this little, like, tidbit, but, like, Darcy pretty much confirms what Charlotte says about Jane, not long after, like, Jane and Bingley seem to have their, like, flirtation going on, that because Jane is just so freaking nice, not everybody, because not everyone has, like, the knowledge of Jane Bennet that Lizzie has, where to Lizzie it's absolutely obvious that Jane is in love with Mr. Bingley.
Yeah.
But it's not obvious to the rest of the world because she just looks like she's being really nice because she's like that to everybody. Yeah,
and Charlotte says a woman had better show more affection than she feels in order to secure a man. You know, it's the idea that they can fall in love after the wedding.
Right. But it's...
And yeah, that's essentially Darcy just says he thought Jane was indifferent.
Mm-hmm. Because Darcy has no idea that...
That's just Jane.
Jane is relatively shy and does not express more than what she feels. But even then, what she feels doesn't necessarily always get, like, portrayed correctly.
Yes. We also find out that what the real story is of Wickham. I guess some people could look at it and say Darcy's side, but, like, I find this to be the real one because I don't think Darcy could lie about this.
With what we know about Darcy, he does not strike you as a person who would make something up to truly ruin a person.
Especially not when it includes his own sister.
Exactly. Especially when it's so close to home. There's no way that he could possibly just make something up for the sake of making something up. Like, I don't even think he truly, like, meant to, like, make anything up about Jane to get Bingley to not...
He seems like a very honest man.
Because he, like, Darcy could see that Bingley was truly falling for Jane, but he didn't want his friend to throw his life away on something that it's like, are you absolutely sure that she is going, like, that she is gung-ho for you, sir?
Yeah.
Like, are we positive that you are who you, like, actually in all of this for the right reasons?
Yeah.
He is like the solid conscience friend.
Yes. And we find out that Mr. Wickham didn't want the living that he was promised. He wanted the money, which he was given. He gambled it all away. And then he came back for more, and Darcy said no. So what did Wickham decide to do? He decided to try to seduce Georgiana Darcy so that he could get her 30,000, which was her inheritance, and ends up sort of breaking her heart because Darcy finds them before they can elope, and Wickham essentially is like, well, fine. Didn't want her anyways.
Yep.
Which is so sad. I feel so bad for Georgiana.
Yep. And like we get a little bit of how like Lizzie feels about the letter, and that it's essentially it's a lot for Lizzie to take in because she's truly having to reevaluate her perspective on Fitzwilliam Darcy.
And even on Wickham.
That too. But like I think to an extent, like her opinion of Wickham was already waning.
Yeah, she was like, well, it's okay.
Because I mean, like Wickham essentially had already kind of left for another woman. Like he was already pursuing another woman for money.
Who was worth more money? Miss King.
And so like you already have a slight impression of that Wickham's nothing more than a gold digger. And
sorry, started singing in my head.
But like essentially that's the kind of person that Wickham is. And Lizzie had already just accepted like, that was essentially like a summer fling, and now we've moved on.
Yeah, she's like, I'm good. It's kind of the same thing. I never desired his good opinion.
It wasn't like Lizzie had imagined herself being married to Mr. Wickham.
No.
She enjoyed his company. She liked the fact that he
could hold conversation.
Like, that was it. That doesn't necessarily mean, yes, let me say yes and get a ring on this finger to, like, signify that we are one. Like, no.
Nah, she ain't worried about that.
She was not worried about it at all.
So Darcy and Fitzwilliam leave. Mm-hmm. And not too long after, we also get Lizzie and Mariah leaving. Mm-hmm. Back to Hunsford.
And not long after she gets back, Lydia has been invited to go to Brighton.
Oh, Lord.
Lydia's excited to go to Brighton, and Kitty's quite upset because Kitty feels like she's been slighted because, well, she is the older of the two. Therefore, she feels like she should be allowed to go, but she wasn't invited. Lydia was specifically invited to be companion to one of the colonel's wives.
And Mr. Bennet, he's like, he concedes because Lydia will never be easy until she has exposed herself in some public place or other.
But Lizzie still cautions him against it because
she knows what she knows about Wickham.
Not only does she know what she knows about Wickham, but it's also just do you realize like the magnitude that her actions can have on the entire family?
Yes, everything that Lydia does comes back to us, and it's sort of it's an important moment later. But Lizzie talks to Jane, and they decide to keep the information about Wickham quiet, which obviously comes back later once what happens with Lydia happens. That I could have prevented it had I only been honest with my sisters.
Right, but also around this time, the Gardiners have brought Jane back from London. And they have proposed to take Lizzie on a trip to see the different districts of the area, but they don't have necessarily enough time to go through all of it. So they specifically get to go through Derbyshire.
Which is where Pemberley is. And Pemberley is where Mr. Darcy lives.
And we get the sense that Mrs. Gardiner grew up in this area. She's familiar with it. And so you have, that sense of, you have a little bit of nostalgia coming from her.
So she's excited to see that. Mm-hmm. And so they go to actually visit Pemberley, which is the coolest thing on the planet. That you just back in the day, you just went and visited people's houses and asked if you could take a tour because they all had art, and all of those, rich couples back then had so much stuff because their families had owned those houses for generations.
Right.
So they get to go see this beautiful grand house that is Pemberley.
Initially, Lizzie kind of pushes back a little bit just because she feels awkward at the fact of well, what if he's there? I literally just refused this man.
I found out so much information recently. I just don't know if I can see him. But they find out that Mr. Darcy is away on business and is not supposed to be back until the next day with a large party.
Yep.
So why not, right?
Mm-hmm.
You thought, Lizzie. You thought.
And well, it's like, and some of the things that they get to see, like there is a likeness. There's a picture of Wickham that still hangs up in the house because, you know, he grew up there. But you also get to see, you know, portraits of Fitzwilliam and Georgiana, and you get to find out just from like the staff's perspective of what kind of a man is Darcy, and they have nothing but nice things to say about him.
Mrs. Reynolds is completely flattering.
You have more of like Lizzie's perspective actually changing. I think the letter is really like the initial like kick of
turning point.
Maybe I've like thought poorly of this man before, but like, you know, my opinion's changing.
Yes.
But her visit to Pemberley is truly like the major moment that everything truly shifts, because she's getting to see other people who have seen him in different lights because of, you know, just different situations. And they've known him. I mean, there's a number of staff members that have known him since he was a little boy. And so they have a differing opinion. So that, I mean, like, they saw him through the unruly teen years and, you know, all of the not pleasant sides.
And so while they're at Pemberley and she's having sort of this, recollection of, oh my God, maybe I've been so wrong all this time. Who did they run into? But Mr. Darcy. And Mr. Darcy then really wants Lizzie to meet his sister. Which just shows that he still likes her despite the fact that she said no.
I wonder if it's a little bit of the absence makes the heart grow fonder.
Yes. So in chapter 44, I don't think we've mentioned a chapter in a while, but we're in chapter 44. Darcy brings Georgiana to meet Lizzie, and Georgiana's very excited. And they describe Georgiana as tall, and her figure was formed. She was womanly and graceful.
Because I want to say she's like 16 or 17.
I think she's supposed to be like 16 or 17 at this point, yes.
Yeah, because I don't know.
The thing that happened with Mr. Wickham.
Well, because of the thing that happened with Mr. Wickham, that happened when she was 15.
Yes.
But I think it's only been like a year and a half.
You never get like full established how long it's been.
Right. Like there is a significant amount of time to where like she is definitely not still 15.
Yes.
So it's not like, oh, this was only like a few months ago when this happened. Like, no,
it's been a hot minute.
It's been a substantial amount of time.
Yeah.
But it's obvious with the way that, like, because Georgiana is excited to meet Lizzie, really wants to meet Lizzie, that Darcy has truly, like, affectionately spoken about Lizzie to his sister.
He's been talking about her so much that Georgiana is just very excited to be her friend. And they also bring Bingley with them. Charles Bingley is back, who's like one of the first things he wants to know is how well her family is, which we all know what that means.
Yes, he's trying to sound like he's being polite, but we all know, dude, you want to know about Jane.
Just about Jane.
You just want to know about Jane. You don't care about the rest of the family,
but
which is fine.
It's not polite to ask just about Jane.
Yes.
And from there we get, which is something we don't really get this in the 2005 version, but they have dinner at Pemberley with Bingley and Darcy and Georgiana and Caroline and Louisa and Mr. Hurst. And
well, and this is where, like, because I wrote it down in chapter 45, you really like see how Lizzie has determined that Caroline Bingley is honestly just jealous.
I wrote the first sentence of chapter 45 in my notes.
Yes.
And she also sees how reserved Georgiana is, which I think gives her another view into Darcy. That she's like, if this is how reserved Georgiana is, no wonder Darcy is the way that he is. They're both this way. And
also in chapter 45, Caroline tries really hard to discredit Lizzie in Darcy's eyes.
Really hard.
Like, painfully hard.
And really rather rudely. But again, I don't think Caroline would be privy to all of the information about Wickham. So, like, the things that she does, well, She wouldn't know not to say those things in front of Georgiana. In chapter 46, Lizzie receives a letter from Jane about Lydia running away with Mr. Wickham. Oh, no.
Yep. And I think it's interesting because it's definitely not necessarily what would have been like normal for their society, but Lizzie chooses to confide in Darcy. I think it shows just kind of how like their relationship has changed, just in the fact that their opinions of each other have changed.
Yeah. And it shows very much how much her opinion has changed of him when after he leaves, she thinks that he just wants to be rid of her because of what's going on. She thinks that he leaves in haste because he can't be around her anymore.
But I think there's also a sense of like part of the reason why Lizzie chooses to share that information with Darcy is because he already knows what kind of man Wickham is.
He's already been through it.
And I think it's incredible like what Darcy chooses to go do.
I know. But Lizzie is so... She's very distraught, not only for Lydia, but she says never had she so honestly felt that she could have loved him as now, when all love must be vain. She just thinks that he's done with her.
Well, like she finally reaches a point where it's like, no. I could actually do this. I could actually love him. I could actually be a part of life.
And Lydia proves that she will do anything for attention.
Yes.
So then they have to leave and they have to go to Longbourn because Mr. Bennet has asked for Mr. Gardner's help in finding Lydia.
The Gardners like kind of go back and forth on the whole like Wickham situation, but it's mentioned that like Lydia has never actually like been taught how to be sensible. So it's just kind of like, oh, she just does whatever. And she's never been punished for it.
It's kind of true if you think about it.
Oh, it absolutely is true. Which is why it's so interesting, the kind of marriage that we kind of get to see.
Yeah.
From them. Because, you know, spoiler alert.
Yeah, spoiler alert, they have to get married.
They like because of society's like dictations at the time, like the only way that it could have been rendered like honorable is them getting married.
Yeah, which we do learn that Mr. Wickham had no plans to marry Lydia.
Nope, none at all.
He just was doing it.
It was out of spite. I'm pretty confident it was out of spite to get back at Lizzie.
Get back at Lizzie for who knows what.
Right. Like what did Lizzie do? Change her mind? Heaven forbid a woman change her mind.
And it's obvious that he didn't care for Lizzie that much.
Right.
Because he went on to Miss King. Like, it's ridiculous. It's also sort of we sort of get to see the failings, and you sort of mentioned it, of Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Bennet. In that they've never done anything to fix Lydia as far as like ensuring that she understands what behavior is okay and what behavior is not okay.
Right.
We also get a letter from Mr. Collins who says the death of your daughter would have been a blessing in comparison of this.
Yep.
It's just further proof that Mr. Collins is crazy.
Absolutely. And also in that same letter, that's when we find out that like Mr. Collins is not above sharing information that really should be like kept close to home. Which I honestly wonder, like, why does Mr. Collins even know in the first place?
News travels fast, I guess.
Like, did somebody from the Bennet household tell him, and that's why
or
he
did
knows?
Somebody from Charlotte's family tell Charlotte, and that's how he knows?
Right. Like, it's never clear how it is that like he actually knows that this is going on. Because as we've already established before, I can't imagine Mr. Darcy saying anything about it.
No.
So why would Lady Catherine know? Except for the fact that Mr. Collins told her. And then why does he know from the get-go?
Yeah, and it's never established, so we will never know. But we also, Mr. Bennet returns from trying to find Lydia and sort of goes nuts in trying to ensure that this never happens again. He essentially tells Kitty and Mary, more so directed at Kitty, but he directs it to everybody, that there will be no more balls and there will be no more fun until they can prove that they've done something of use every day. And it's like that thing of like, well, okay, you're veering off too far now.
Yep.
You were too lenient earlier, and now you're being too strict.
Yeah. He literally does like a full 180 on that one. But we find out in a letter from Mr. Gardner that Lydia and Wickham have been found and that they are going to be getting married. And we find out the terms of Lydia's marriage. And it's Mr. Bennet in the novel that makes the comment about the fact that Wickham would be an idiot for accepting something less than 10,000 pounds.
And typically the adaptations make Lizzie say that.
Well, I think he says it in the 95, but most of the other ones, it's typically Lizzie who makes a comment, because that's the scriptwriter's like way of showing that this is Lizzie trying to voice what she knows without actually voicing what she knows.
And we find out that Lydia and Wickham are going to be married. Mrs. Bennet is all smiles. She's been teary-eyed and dramatic and in her bed and get me my smelling salts. And then suddenly her youngest daughter is going to be married after she's been hiding out with a man. But it's okay, because she's finally going to have a daughter that's married. And is that all you think about?
And we do get the sense of what kind of relationship Kitty and Lydia have, because it's mentioned that, well, none of this was surprising to Kitty.
Yeah.
So that must have meant that Lydia sent Kitty a letter telling her everything.
Yep, exactly.
So essentially you have Jane and Lizzie as, you know, like that pairing of sisters, and then you have Kitty and Lydia, which literally just leaves Mary to be by herself.
Mary is literally the definition of middle child.
Yes.
Mr. Bennet tries to say that Lydia and Wickham will never be admitted to Longbourn. We see how long that lasts.
Yes. I mean, I don't blame Mr. Bennet for his opinion on that one, but it clearly did not last, because they come to Longbourn.
He didn't stick to his guns.
And we get to see Wickham interact with Lizzie again, and he tries to be charming and tries to be like, you know, like, we can be friends, right? We're brother and sister now. We can be friends, right?
And Lizzie's all, sure.
Yeah, not on your life, hun.
And Lydia saying that all of her sisters should go to Brighton because that is the best place to find husbands. But, you know, none of them particularly like Lydia's way of finding a husband.
Yes.
It's not appropriate.
And then, so they have, you know, their little stay, and then Wickham has been sent to something else, has gotten a new commission, so he has to go somewhere else. And so as they're leaving, Mrs. Bennet's like, oh, you know, you need to write to me. And this is where Lydia says, and honestly, like, the shift in Lydia's character from, like, beforehand to, like, now that she's married Lydia has a very holier than thou, I'm better than everybody else kind of opinion. And you really get that sense in this statement of, my sisters may write to me, or else they'll have nothing to do. Like, you really think that your sisters have nothing else to do? Nothing better with their time to do than write to you, who will literally have nothing else to do with their time.
I would rather sew a handkerchief than write to Lydia. Like, that's how I feel. That's how I would feel as one of her sisters. I will sew everything in this house before I write to you. I will embroider the entire couch before I write to you. And we also, Lydia spills the beans that Mr. Darcy was at her wedding.
Yes.
And she should not have said that, but then Lizzie is forced to write to Mrs. Gardner because Mrs. Gardner was also there and ask her, is this true? It's interesting, too, when Wickham's trying to be Lizzie's friend and all of this, that he continues to lie about Mr. Darcy.
Mm-hmm.
And Lizzie sort of insinuates that she knows the truth. I think Wickham, you can sort of, even in the book, you sort of feel he's like, okay, I'm gonna back away now. She knows, so I'm just gonna go on my merry way. And they leave. And after Lydia and Wickham leave, we learn that Mr. Bingley has returned to Netherfield. And Jane says she no longer has feelings for him. She vows that she no longer has feelings and only dreads other people's remarks.
Where she's wanting to, protect herself, especially after the aftermath of Lydia and Wickham, and also just, like the generic like emotions that she has from all of the, well, maybe he doesn't actually like me like I thought he liked me, like stuff. Like she has so many emotions that she's honestly never truly been allowed to express or feel. Mm-hmm. That it's like, well.
She's literally just trying to protect herself.
She is. And this is probably the most like protection of self that we see from Jane. And so but then Bingley comes and visits. Things are awkward. Bingley
brings
leaves.
Mr. Darcy.
He does bring Mr. Darcy that first time.
And it's still awkward.
It is. And then he leaves. He comes back, just Bingley.
For dinner.
Yep. And the night ends in proposal.
Yes, because Mrs. Bennet schemes to leave him and Jane alone in a room together. Mm-hmm. She's like, if we just leave them alone, they will be married. This is my whole plan come to life. I mean, it works. Genuinely. But what a sort of dangerous game to play in a society where you weren't supposed to be left alone with a man to leave your daughter alone. And Jane is suddenly the favorite child after Lydia has become the favorite child for getting married.
Yes, the excitement of Lydia's stuff is very fleeting.
Yeah. Because Jane will have 5,000 a year.
Exactly.
So exciting.
And what could be better?
What could be better than 5,000 a year? Well, that's all good and well, but a week later, who should show up?
But Lady Catherine de Bourgh.
And she accuses Lizzie of having designs on Mr. Darcy and spreading the rumor that she's engaged. As if, like, Lizzie didn't fully deny Mr. Darcy. But not that she knows that. Right. And then she asks Lizzie to promise that she'll never get engaged to Mr. Darcy.
And she's like, no.
I will not do that.
Because, A, that's restricting to me. And B, why would I?
I don't have to answer to you. And, Lady Catherine's only real response to that is, are the shades of Pemberley to be thus polluted?
Exactly.
Oh, my goodness.
But then, because of how that conversation goes, that gives Darcy hope. So Darcy tries again. They
go on a walk, which is a little romantic. And Lizzie thanks Darcy for what he did for Lydia and for her entire family in that vein. And Mr. Darcy says that his feelings have not changed. And that he still feels the same as he did. It's so romantic.
And therefore we have another engagement. And I mean, like, Mr. Bennet kind of, questions Lizzie a little bit. It's like, are you sure are you feeling okay?
I thought you hated this man.
Which is generally like her entire family's like stance on it. It's like, we thought you didn't like this guy. And she's like, well, I was wrong. And I've come to actually really care about him. And so,
Yeah, he says, I could not have parted with you, my Lizzie, to anyone less worthy. And of course, at that point, Mr. Bennet does not know what Darcy's done.
Which Lizzie then tells him.
Yeah.
But also makes sure that Mr. Bennet understands, no, he would not want you to repay him. Just
you can't speak of it. And then Lizzie becomes the favorite child. Why? Because she will have 10,000 a year.
Exactly.
It's ridiculous. And
then chapter 61 is essentially kind of a, all right, everybody's married and this is kind of what's going on. And it says things like Kitty would go and stay with Jane and Lizzie. Mary is the only one who ever actually stays at home. But and Lydia writes to Lizzie for money.
And that is all she wants is money.
Yep. And Lizzie just says no.
No, absolutely not. And that is the book.
Thanks for tuning in to League of Lit. If you have any suggestions for an episode, feel free to leave a comment on leagueoflit.tumblr.com.